This is Pod Populi.
Podcast for the people.
Welcome back to the Wedding Buzz. It's your host, Sydney, and today I am here alone. It's just me, you guys, and I wanted some time for just us to chat. I love having guests and hearing all about their stories and how they started their businesses and their perspective on weddings, but sometimes I just want to chat with you guys and talk from a planner's perspective. So I was thinking about it and thinking about what should I talk about? And one thing that I ask everyone that's on the podcast is, do you have any wedding day horror stories? And sometimes we hear crazy stuff. Just last week, we had Jill talking about trying to get a giant dog, I think it was a St. Bernard, into the car, and her needing the valet guys from the hotel to help her lift this dog. I've heard things about the wind blowing an entire arch over during the ceremony, in-laws stealing the card box. We've had a van full of wedding cakes get into a car accident and falling over. Crazy stuff, you guys. But I realize I've never answered the question. Now, thankfully, I don't have any crazy wedding day horror stories, knock on wood here, because I bet you now that I said that, my next wedding, something's going to happen. But I have had some, I guess you could say, unfortunate events that I take everything as a learning lesson. So I thought it would be good to talk about it. Some of them are, again, nothing bad, but, learning lessons. So let's dive in. We can talk about some of my own wedding day horror stories. And yeah, what happened and how we, tackled it. So the first one that comes to mind was back when I was just a wedding planner's assistant, back in the day before I had my own company. We were doing a wedding on the beach in Delray, and it was in June, middle of summer in South Florida. Absolutely ridiculously hot. If someone can tell me why people insist on doing outdoor weddings in the summer in Florida, even as a wedding planner, I can't tell you the answer. I don't know why people choose to do this. I try to steer them away from it, but people do it anyway. So the ceremony was on the beach in the sand, absolutely no shade. And then the cocktail hour was on a pool deck right by the beach. Again, no shade. An older gentleman that I think he was the bride's great uncle or something like that. Well, he had a heat stroke and everything ended up okay. And he was okay. But he did pass out, had heat stroke. We had to call 911. He had to come. And, it is a horror story and it's not a horror story in the sense of he was okay. It didn't ruin the entire wedding day, but it definitely took a damper on the day. And that's what people are remembering from that cocktail hour. And that was the drama of the day. The big talk of the day was someone having a heat stroke, which is very unfortunate. Thank God he was okay. It easily could have not gone well. But yeah, that was kind of the focus of the day, is how hot everybody was to the point of somebody needing to go to the hospital, instead of the focus on the day being how beautiful the bride was and how great and fun the actual wedding was. So since we're talking about, this topic of weddings being super hot and time of year, I'm in South Florida, and if you guys are in South Florida, if you're local here or anywhere, honestly, think about this. The heat is one thing just to think about, along with just the general comfort of your guests. You guys, although everyone puts so much focus on what the wedding looks like, you want the guests to actually enjoy the day. And when everyone is super hot and it's just everyone's sweating, including yourself, if you're the bride, it's just not fun and enjoyable for anybody. This past weekend, I was doing a wedding, and now it's September right now, so you would think it's not as hot as June, but let me tell you, it's really, really hot. And this bride this past weekend had a first look with her bridesmaids. She had a first look with her dad. She had a first look with her stepdad. All of this before the ceremony. And now she didn't do a first look with the groom, but often people do a first look with the groom as well. And the photographer is always going to try to drag you outside to take pictures outside because it's just better lighting and they come out better. But the thing is, everyone's sweating. Everyone's so hot and uncomfortable. And in between the first look with her bridesmaids and then the first look with her dad, she was like, I want to go inside in the AC for a second. So now we're moving her. She has a big dress and a train. And again, it wasn't like a problem or a horror story on my end of things. I just felt bad because she was a sweaty mess. Her bridesmaids were a sweaty mess. Her dad in his suit. Everyone is hot and sweaty and you're trying to take pictures and it's just like it's not comfortable and it's not worth it, in my opinion, to put everybody through that just because you want to get married in a certain time of year. I highly suggest waiting until cooler months, again, especially if you're in South Florida. Now, if you are in South Florida and you are doing a wedding when it's hot outside, and I'll give you this, Florida especially is hot from about April through November. Like most of the time, it is really, really hot. And so some of these situations are hard to avoid. So what you can do, first of all, is try to find venues or spaces to take photos that are indoors if possible, somewhere with good lighting. But even with that said, your photographer is going to try to drag you outside. But the next thing you can do is I would highly suggest doing more of your photos during the cocktail hour rather than prior to ceremony. Although timeline-wise, it's nice to get things out of the way prior to ceremony, it's a lot of back and forth of trying to go outside, trying to hide from the groom, trying to do this and that, and you end up, again, a hot and sweaty mess before your ceremony even begins. And like most of the time, the bride is getting her hair and makeup done hours before these pictures and hours before the ceremony. The more things that you put prior to ceremony, the earlier your hair and makeup needs to be done, which means the longer it needs to last. And let me tell you, I don't care how good your setting spray is, that Florida heat is going to make you melt. And so if you're doing a wedding outside or just the photos outside and you are in South Florida, but even, it gets hot all over the place in the summer. So if you're doing anything like a summer wedding, I would highly suggest to, again, try to put more things in the cocktail hour because you'll be fresher for your ceremony and everybody wants to look nice and fresh for your ceremony. If you're doing that, I would suggest doing an hour and a half cocktail hour so that you have time for all these photos. Your guests will be fine. Just feed them, give them a bar. They will be fine for an hour and a half, I promise you. And then also, I strongly believe that it's worth paying your hair and makeup artist to stay with you up until the ceremony at least, and possibly through cocktail hour. It's going to be maybe a couple $100 in the grand scheme of a wedding. When you're spending thousands, this couple $100 is well worth it. And you will, have someone there to help touch you up and you'll look perfect for your photos. You'll feel better. I take my advice. I have brides all the time being like, oh my gosh, I'm melting, or like my hair is a rat's nest and this and that. And it seems like really simple problems. And in the grand scheme of things, it is, but you want to look and feel your best on your wedding day. So I would say that is well worth the investment of having someone stay to touch you up. And, just think about these things. Try to schedule your day in the best way possible so that you and your guests and your family are all feeling good. Because if you're the bride, it's your day. You want to look and feel your best, but honestly, your family does too. Your guests want to look nice, and beyond just looking nice, they want to feel good. Like that bride's uncle who had a heat stroke, he was not feeling good. He did not enjoy the day. You don't want your guest, even if it doesn't end in a horror, like someone passing out, if they're sitting there hot and sweaty and uncomfortable, they're not enjoying the day. So just try to think about everyone's comfort as you're planning your day, especially your own. It will go a long way. I promise you that. So I have one more horror story that I want to touch on. Again, it's not really a major horror story, but it is something, a bump in the road, an obstacle that led to, a bride in tears, which we don't want any tears on wedding day. So I'm going to dive into that in just one moment. We're going to take a quick break, but I'll be right back to tell you about this next story. All right, you guys, we are back from break, and I have this next horror story to tell you. Again, not a major horror story, but a learning lesson. And I hate to say this, I'm spilling, I guess, the tea on my own sister. But yes, you guys, this story is about my own sister. And if you're hearing this, I'm sorry that I'm talking about this. But it wasn't her fault. It wasn't really anyone's fault. And it was a good learning lesson. So my sister got married a few years before I started my own wedding business. I had worked in the wedding world, but I actually was out of it. I was doing my master's degree, and I was working in project management. I hadn't started my own business yet. I hadn't found my way back into the wedding world. So at my sister's wedding, I was simply just sister, maid of honor, and that's about it, with some wedding knowledge from my background and working in it, but I was not the planner or anything like that. My sister had a beautiful wedding. She got married up in the mountains of North Carolina. It was October. The weather was perfect. The weather was absolutely beautiful. The leaves were just starting to change colors. It was like such a stunning wedding day. So they had their ceremony, and then they did all their photos during the cocktail hour. And when they got back from photos, it was pretty much time to do the grand entrance. I believe she only did a 1 hour cocktail hour, and she did not do a first look prior to the ceremony. We did like bridesmaids photos before the ceremony, and we did, she did a first look with my dad, and the groomsmen did their photos, but there was no, group photos because there was no first look. And so with only 1 hour cocktail hour, it was, going pretty quick. And by the time they got back from photos, it was time to do this grand entrance. And all the guests were sitting in the reception space, myself included. I was having a grand old time. I was hanging out with like my friends, and we, were starting to hit the bar. And her planner came in and got me and was like, hey, she needs help with her bustle. Can you come help? And I was like, yeah. And so I ran out there, but I had heard about her bustle, and I obviously knew that like bustling a dress was a thing, but I hadn't seen what her bustle was going to look like. I wasn't there for her alteration appointment. I didn't really know too much about it. So I go outside. The way that her venue was is she was literally like outside. It wasn't like she was outside of the reception room, but like inside a building. We were outside. It was absolutely pitch black dark. There wasn't good lighting. And her bustle had clear buttons in a big wedding dress with a long train. And let me tell you guys, I wear contacts. I have terrible eyesight, like terrible eyesight. I got glasses when I was 3 years old. I could not see these clear buttons for the life of me. And honestly, I didn't know what I was looking for. I had done bustles a little bit before when I was like a wedding planning assistant, but honestly, it was more like, here, hold this piece as someone else is doing the actual buttons. I hadn't paid close attention. And so I didn't know what I was looking for. And so it was time to do the grand entrance, and, the guests are sitting there. Dinner is ready to be served, and time is a ticking. It's probably 15 minutes past time, 20 minutes past time at this point. And none of the guests were like upset. They had lots of like appetizers and whatnot at the cocktail hour, and they had an open bar. But I'm sure everyone was getting hungry, and everyone was probably like, what is happening? What is taking so long? And so I love my sister, and I really don't blame her for this. But after we were really struggling to find the buttons, her wedding planner was like, what if you just go without the bustle and we do it later? Like, let's just get the show on the road. And this broke my sister. She started like hysterically crying because she was just so frustrated. And I will give it to her. Her train was so long. I don't know how in the world she would have done her first dance and the daddy-daughter dance with this long train. I mean, if you've been married before and you had a long train, ask anyone. You can't maneuver in a long wedding dress. And so I don't blame her for being like, what the heck? No, I can't go in there with this long train. And again, this isn't like the worst horror story, but it's a horror story in my book especially because it was my own sister, that she was this upset and stressed on her wedding day. And grand scheme of things, no big deal. But in that moment, it's a lot of pressure when you have 100 people inside sitting, waiting for you to enter, now starting to wonder, something's going wrong. What's going wrong? And then someone's telling you like, oh, just go in and try to do this dance with this long train and spin around, and you're going to trip in front of everybody, and it's going to be on video. Like, I think I was explaining to, it's funny, this past weekend, I had some groomsmen asking me like, do you have bridezillas? And I'm like, I don't like the term bridezilla because there's a lot of pressure on a wedding day. And if anything goes wrong, everybody blames the bride. But they also tell the bride to be chill and don't worry about anything. But as soon as something goes wrong, then she's a bridezilla. So I don't like the term bridezilla. And I don't blame my sister for being upset in this moment. But I count it as a horror story because she was upset. And it was a big learning lesson for me, which, unfortunate for her, but fortunate for all of my brides, is I schedule a good 5-10 minutes for the bustle. And I ask every bride prior to the wedding day, what is your bustle situation? Send me a video. Let me learn what it's supposed to look like and what it's supposed to be like. So anyway, back to the story. Her planner was like, just go in without it. And it like broke her. She was like, no. And so she then said, she was like, Mom knows how to do it. Like, I sent Mom a video of the bustle, or maybe my mom was at her final alteration appointment. So anyway, I ran inside and got my mom, which I feel like I had to do it. I had to go ask my mom because we were struggling out there. I also none of us had our cell phones. I don't even know where my phone was on, it might be in my husband's pocket or something, but none of us had our phones, which we could have used a flashlight. And so we needed help. And so I ran in, but I kind of felt bad because obviously that caused more attention with the planner going in to get me, and then I walk out. And then I come back in and get my mom, and then we walk out. And we did it very slyly, if that's a word. But it definitely caught people's attention of something's going wrong. Anyway, I got my mom. She brought her phone. We used her flashlight. She kind of helped in the sense of she remembered where the buttons should be, but she didn't have her glasses and she couldn't see anything either. And so we ended up getting it between my mom saying where the buttons should be, and then my brother-in-law, my sister's new husband, he went into I think he went into new hubby mode. He was like, oh no, my wife is crying and it's our wedding day. And he was like, we're going to fix this. And so once my mom was able to kind of tell him where the buttons should be, he was able to find them, and we got her dress bustled, and it was an absolutely beautiful wedding day. They went in, they did their first dance. She did the daddy-daughter dance. Everyone got dinner, and we danced the night away, and it was fantastic. Again, I know this isn't a horrific story or anything like that, but it's a big learning lesson, and it goes beyond just bustling the dress. Yes, make sure that you look at your bustle and have your mom, have your sister, have your best friend learn how to do the bustle, bring them to your alteration appointment, take a video of how your bustle is done, because you'd be surprised how long it takes. Even, like I said, I schedule 5-10 minutes, and if it's a crazy bustle, I'll schedule 15 minutes into the timeline just to be doing this bustle, because it takes a long time, and that can push the wedding day, the wedding timeline and dinner and all of that. And it just causes a point of stress, and you don't want to do that. Guys, my own wedding dress had 27 buttons in its bustle. It had 2 separate layers and a total of 27 buttons. So again, it seems so small, the bustle, but it can cause a lot of stress. It can cause the timeline to go, away from what it should be. And it's just a good learning lesson of all the little details matter. Try to take the time and think through what's going to cause the day to go smoothly, what's going to cause bumps in the road, and try to figure out a game plan. How are you going to tackle that? And make sure that these little things don't cause issues on your wedding day. So with that, we're going to take another quick break, and I'll be right back, because I also ask everyone on the podcast, what's one piece of advice that you want to give? And I'm going to answer that when we get back. All right, we are back. We just talked about 2 kind of horror stories. Again, I know I've said this 10 times now. They're not major horror stories, but I think the horror stories tie into my one piece of advice, which I think my one piece of advice is kind of going to be 2 pieces of advice. But the one piece of advice is, I would say, remember the point of the day. You have to remember the point of the day. Because when things happen, if there are bumps in the road, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters. And it's your wedding day. And here we are talking about the weather, and it's hot, and the bustle of my sister's dress, and all of these little things. And they matter. They definitely matter. But I think the biggest point, my biggest piece of advice is don't let these little things take away from the bigger picture of the day. And like I said, with my sister and the bustle, it was literally 10 minutes of frustration. But the rest of the day was absolutely beautiful. Her guests had no idea what was going on. I mean, they maybe had an idea of like, oh, we're sitting in here waiting for the grand entrance and it's not happening. So like maybe something's happening, but no one really was paying attention. They were talking, a bunch of friends they hadn't seen in forever. They were having a good old time. And so don't let a couple minutes or little bumps in the road ruin the whole point of the day, ruin your whole view and your outlook on what your wedding day was, because it comes and goes really, really fast. And so, my one piece of advice is don't lose sight of what really matters. And, I would advise you to try to plan in advance for those little things. Seek someone with experience, AKA a wedding planner, hire a planner, at least like a month of coordinator, because we have the experience. We see time and time again what causes these bumps in the road. And let me tell you, none of my brides are putting in 10 minutes in the timeline to bustle their dress. It's always like, oh yeah, we'll bustle it, no big deal. No one thinks about how long it could take. No one thinks about, who pinning the boutonnieres on the groomsmen. They're like, oh yeah, the florist is bringing that, but who's going to do it? And what they don't realize is it takes time. I mean, when you have a big group of groomsmen, let's say there's 8-10 guys and it takes, 45 seconds to a minute each person, there's easily 8-10 minutes of trying to pin the boutonnieres on the groomsmen. And again, me as a wedding planner, knowing that, no big deal. I just put it in the timeline and then it's not stress. I have 10 minutes to do this. It's in the timeline. So that's not a bump in the road because it's in the timeline and then no one's stressed and upset and rushing around. When it's not in the timeline and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's time for pictures, but the groomsmen don't have their boutonnieres. And let me tell you, boutonnieres are not easy to pin. So the guys are trying to do it themselves and they never do it right and they're falling over. That's when it becomes a bump in the road. And so although I definitely say, hey, don't let these bumps in the road ruin your whole day, ruin your whole outlook of your wedding, I will say, try to plan in advance. It makes a big difference. Talk to a professional about your timeline. Seek other people. If you really can't afford a wedding planner or something, I guess listen to this podcast, do your research, try to talk to friends and family and those who have been married before and see what their pain points were and see how you can plan in advance to avoid these bumps in the road. With that said, I am so glad that I haven't had major horror stories, just little bumps in the road that are always a learning lesson. And knock on wood, I'm knocking on the desk here. I don't even think it's real wood, but I'm knocking on wood that I don't jinx myself here of a horror story. But like I said, it's really about thinking what bumps in the road could happen and how do I plan to avoid them? And then what do I do if it does happen? And like I said, you just kind of plan accordingly. Put every little detail in your timeline. And then I always put 5-10 minutes randomly in the timeline of wiggle room, because having 5 minutes to when I tell a bride, they're like, what's next? What am I doing? I'm like, you have 5 minutes just to sit and chill. They're like, oh, thank God, And so if we don't need those 5 minutes, great. They have 5 minutes just to rest, get some water. If we do need those 5 minutes, thank God they're there. And then it's no big deal, because we had 5-10 minutes here and there in the timeline to catch up if needed, and everyone's good to go. So with that said, I hope you guys have a great wedding day. If you're in the middle of wedding planning, which you most likely are if you're listening to this podcast, I hope you have a great wedding day. I hope that you guys are having fun in wedding planning. Make sure that you follow along on my Instagram and my TikTok. Instagram is delightful_planning. TikTok is just delightful planning, but I'm always putting tips and tricks and behind the scenes of my wedding days on there. So follow along and hopefully you guys can learn some things as you go. If you're looking for help wedding planning, I'd love to help you. My website is delightfulplanning.com. And let's get in touch. I'm happy to I do free consultations. If you want to, talk about how I can be of help, how it can be a service. If you want coaching, if you're not in South Florida or local and you want just to talk through your wedding day, you need an experienced friend to talk to, I'd love to do that for you. So reach out again, delightfulplanning.com. social media is Delightful Planning. And I hope you guys have a great wedding day, and I hope that you enjoyed this.